The summer sun blazed down on Oak Ridge Estates, a gated community in Northern Virginia that prided itself on perfect lawns, white picket fences, and a long list of HOA rules that seemed to grow thicker every year. On paper, it looked like the kind of place where families thrived, children played on clean sidewalks, and everyone waved politely when passing their neighbors. But behind the trimmed hedges and glossy mailboxes, there was something darker. An obsessive HOA president who treated her neighbors less like people and more like chess pieces she could control. Her name was Margaret Whitfield, though everyone in the neighborhood whispered a simpler name behind her back. The HOA Karen. Mid-50s, sharp blonde bob, navy blue blazers even in the middle of summer, and a clipboard glued to her hand like it was an extension of her arm. She was the self-declared queen of Oak Ridge, and she loved nothing more than making life miserable for anyone who didn't bend to her rigid rules. For my family, she found her favorite target in my younger sister, Emily Carter. Emily was only 24, but her life had been anything but easy. At 16, a devastating car accident left her paralyzed from the waist down. Since then, she had lived her life in a wheelchair. Despite the challenges, Emily was sunshine in human form. Her laugh could light up a room, and she refused to let her disability stop her from pursuing her passions. She had turned her love of painting into a small online business, selling her artwork from our family home. But Margaret saw none of that. All she saw was a wheelchair ramp built onto the front of our house, a ramp she claimed violated the community's aesthetic standards. To Margaret, the ramp wasn't a symbol of independence or necessity. It was an eyesore, and she made sure Emily knew it. It started with letters. Dozens of them. Violation notice. Community standard breach. Warning, ramp not approved by HOA. Each envelope carried the same cold, bureaucratic tone, signed at the bottom with Margaret's flourish. My mother, Linda Carter, tried reasoning with her, explaining that the Americans with Disabilities Act protected modifications like wheelchair ramps. But Margaret didn't care. She believed the HOA's power was above the law, and she wasn't about to let one family change her perfect neighborhood. Emily tried to ignore it, but every letter chipped away at her spirit. She told me once, her voice breaking, "It feels like they're punishing me for existing." And Margaret didn't stop there. She began showing up in person, standing at the edge of our driveway, arms crossed, eyes narrowed like a hawk. One afternoon, when Emily was out front painting under the shade of our oak tree, Margaret marched up and hissed, "You're lowering the value of every house on this street. That ramp, that clutter, you. This neighborhood wasn't meant for people like you." Emily cried for hours after that. I remember wheeling her inside, my hands shaking with rage. But at that time, I was just an older brother working double shifts to pay bills. I didn't have the strength or the connections to fight back. Not yet. Weeks turned into months. Fines piled up, $100, $200, $500. The HOA claimed we owed thousands, even threatening to put a lien on our house. And Margaret escalated again, whispering poison into the ears of neighbors, turning polite waves into cold stares. Soon, families who once brought Emily cookies after her accident now crossed the street to avoid her. She felt isolated in her own community. But the worst came one July afternoon. I was at work when Emily called me, her voice trembling. "They sent the police," she whispered. "What? Who did?" "The HOA, Margaret. She called the cops on me. She told them I was trespassing on my own porch." I couldn't believe it. Margaret had told the police that Emily's wheelchair ramp and art supplies constituted illegal structures and hazardous clutter, framing her as some kind of squatter. By the time the officers showed up, Emily was alone at home, paintbrush still in hand, tears streaking her face as she tried to explain that she lived there, that she belonged. The cops, embarrassed but bound to follow through, questioned her like a criminal. One officer even asked, "Do you have proof this is your residence?" Imagine being asked for proof in front of your own house just because a power-drunk HOA president wanted to flex her authority. When I arrived, they were still there. I'll never forget the sight. My little sister gripping her wheels, shaking, surrounded by two uniformed officers who looked more annoyed than apologetic. Margaret stood a few feet away, arms folded, a smug grin spreading across her face like she had just won a battle. That was the day something inside me snapped. And little did Margaret know, that day marked the beginning of the end. Because what she didn't count on, what she couldn't have possibly prepared for, was that Emily wasn't alone. She had family. And not just me. She had two brothers who had spent the last decade training as elite warriors, serving overseas, and protecting America from enemies far greater than one petty HOA tyrant. My twin brothers, Jack and James Carter, both Navy SEALs, were on their way home. And once they heard what Margaret had done, there would be no more letters, no more fines, no more intimidation. For the first time in years, Margaret Whitfield, the queen of Oak Ridge Estates, was about to realize she had finally picked a fight she couldn't win. The night after the police came, our home felt different. The walls were the same, the pictures on the mantel hadn't moved, but the air itself seemed heavier, poisoned with humiliation. Emily barely spoke at dinner. She pushed food around her plate, her hands trembling every time she glanced at the unopened envelopes stacked by the fruit bowl. The latest batch of HOA fines and threats. My mother tried to hold it together, her voice calm, but I could see the fury simmering in her eyes. "It isn't right," she said. "You'd think a woman like Margaret would have some heart, some compassion." But compassion wasn't in Margaret's vocabulary. The next morning, as if the police visit hadn't been enough, she doubled down. She showed up at our door with 2 board members from the HOA, both men in polo shirts and khakis, the kind who wore their authority like it was stitched onto their collars. They carried clipboards and cameras, snapping photos of our ramp, our porch, even Emily's potted flowers. Emily sat inside by the window, watching with wide, wet eyes. "Why are they doing this?" she whispered. "They're trying to scare us," I said, jaw tight. "Trying to make us think we don't belong here." When I stepped outside, Margaret gave me that same smug smile. "We've documented multiple violations," she said, holding up her clipboard like it was a weapon. "Unapproved ramp structure, excessive clutter, unauthorized business operations." She glanced toward Emily's art supplies through the glass. "This house is out of compliance." I clenched my fists. "My sister is disabled. She needs that ramp. And selling paintings online isn't a violation of anything. She's not running a warehouse." Margaret's lips curled. "Rules are rules. If you don't like them, perhaps Oak Ridge Estates isn't the right community for your family." It took everything in me not to shout. I knew yelling would only give her more ammunition, more proof that we were problem neighbors. So I bit my tongue, but inside, I was burning. That evening, Emily had a panic attack. I found her in her room, clutching the arms of her wheelchair, gasping for breath. "I can't take it anymore," she sobbed. "Every time I go outside, I feel like they're watching me, waiting to catch me doing something wrong. I didn't ask for this. I didn't ask for any of this." I knelt beside her, holding her hand, my own eyes stinging. "You're not alone, Em. You hear me? You are not alone." But the truth was, I felt powerless. I was just one man with a regular job, living paycheck to paycheck. The HOA had money, lawyers, influence, and Margaret had a way of twisting the narrative so that we always looked like the villains. 2 days later, the police came again. This time, it was because Margaret filed a complaint that Emily's ramp was unsafe and a danger to children in the neighborhood. 2 officers showed up, awkwardly measuring the incline, jotting down notes, even though we had city permits and medical necessity documentation. Emily sat silently the whole time, her face pale, tears gathering but refusing to fall. Margaret stood nearby, arms folded, pretending to be a concerned citizen. At one point, she even leaned toward one officer and said, "It's such a shame. We try so hard to keep this community beautiful, but one family can ruin everything." That was the moment Emily finally broke. She wheeled herself forward, her voice shaking but loud enough for everyone to hear. "Do you know what it's like to lose the use of your legs? Do you know what it's like to wake up every day trapped in a chair, fighting to live some kind of normal life? And now I'm being told I don't belong in my own home because it's not pretty enough for you?" The officers shifted uncomfortably. One cleared his throat and muttered, "Ma'am, we're just following up on a report." Margaret smirked, scribbling something on her clipboard. To her, Emily's pain wasn't tragedy, it was victory. After the cops left, I called my twin brothers. They were stationed states away, wrapping up a deployment cycle, but I couldn't keep the pain out of my voice as I explained what happened. "They're destroying her," I said. "They're tearing her apart piece by piece. She's not the same person anymore. She doesn't laugh, she doesn't smile, she doesn't even want to go outside." There was silence on the other end of the line, followed by a low, controlled voice. It was Jack, the older twin by 7 minutes. "We'll be there," James chimed in, his tone sharper. "Don't do anything yet. Don't give that woman more fuel. Wait for us." I hung up the phone, a weight lifting off my chest. For the first time in months, I felt hope. Because if there was one thing I knew about my brothers, it was that they didn't lose. Not in combat zones, not in training, and certainly not against a woman hiding behind HOA bylaws. In the days leading up to their return, Margaret kept pressing. More fines, more letters. She even spread a rumor that Emily's business was drawing in strangers and lowering property values. Neighbors began leaving nasty notes in our mailbox, telling us to do the right thing and move. Emily started avoiding windows altogether. She painted less, slept less, and one night I caught her staring at a packed bag by her wheelchair. "Maybe she's right," Emily whispered. "Maybe we don't belong here." My throat tightened. "No, this is our home, and she doesn't get to decide that." And then, at last, the day came. It was a quiet Saturday morning when Jack and James rolled into the driveway, their pickup truck still dusted with mud from the road. Both of them stepped out wearing jeans and plain t-shirts, but even in civilian clothes, they carried themselves with the unmistakable presence of warriors. Broad shoulders, steady eyes, the kind of men who had seen darkness and returned stronger. Emily wheeled herself out onto the porch, her lips trembling as tears finally spilled. "You're here," she whispered. Jack crouched in front of her, his hand on hers. "Always." James looked toward Margaret's house across the street, where the blinds twitched ever so slightly. He smirked. "So that's her?" I nodded. James cracked his knuckles. "Good, let's get to work." Margaret thought she had broken my sister. What she didn't know was that she had just awakened the wrong family. From the moment my brothers arrived, the atmosphere in our home changed. The fear that had crept into every corner of the house began to lift, replaced by a steady undercurrent of strength. Where I had felt powerless, Jack and James radiated control. Years of training, combat, and discipline had molded them into men who didn't flinch at adversity. The first thing they did was listen. That evening, we gathered around the kitchen table. Emily in her chair, Mom with her hands clasped tightly, me leaning forward, and laid out every violation notice, every fine, every threat letter. The stack was inches thick. Jack flipped through them one by one, his jaw tightening. "Half of this is intimidation," he muttered. "None of it would hold up in court." James smirked. "This Margaret lady thinks she's running a dictatorship. She has no idea what happens when she messes with people who actually know how to fight back." Emily's eyes were wide. "You don't understand. She's relentless. She doesn't stop. Even when I tell her what it's doing to me, she just smiles." Jack leaned forward, his tone calm but firm. "Then we'll make her stop. Not with fists. Not with shouting. With strategy. The same way we'd take down an enemy compound. Gather intel. Expose weaknesses. Strike clean, strike smart." James tapped the stack of papers. "First move is to flip the script. She's been writing the story, painting you as the problem. We're about to change that narrative." The next morning, they began their mission. While I went to work, Jack and James walked the neighborhood. On the surface, they looked casual, two brothers strolling through suburbia. But I knew what they were doing. They were studying terrain, observing patterns, identifying allies and enemies. Years of military intelligence work had sharpened their instincts. They spoke with neighbors, not aggressively, but with quiet confidence. They introduced themselves, asked questions, listened more than they talked. Slowly, they pieced together a picture of Margaret's reign of fear. One elderly couple confessed that Margaret had fined them for having a bird feeder. Another man admitted she threatened to tow his truck for parking too close to the curb. Parents revealed she once shut down a children's lemonade stand for lacking a vendor permit. "She's been terrorizing everyone," Jack told me later. "People comply because they're scared, but the fear is shallow. They're waiting for someone to stand up." That evening, James brought home copies of the HOA bylaws. He had convinced a sympathetic board member to let him borrow them. For hours, the twins pored over the documents, highlighting contradictions and illegal clauses. "Look at this," James said, pointing at a section. "She's been fining people for things the bylaws don't even cover. That's fraud." Jack leaned back, arms crossed. "We need evidence. Photos, statements, recordings. Build a case that even her lawyers can't weasel out of." Emily, who had been quiet most of the day, finally spoke. "What if it doesn't work? What if she just finds another way to hurt us?" Jack turned to her, his voice softer than I'd ever heard it. In my world, we've faced warlords, insurgents, people who'd rather die than give up control. You know what we learned? No tyrant is invincible. They all fall. Margaret is no different." For the first time in weeks, Emily smiled faintly. Over the next few days, the operation took shape. The twins treated it like a mission. Jack coordinated with neighbors willing to talk, gathering written testimonies. James set up discreet cameras near our property line to document harassment. They logged every interaction, every visit from Margaret, every violation notice that showed up. And sure enough, Margaret couldn't resist. On the third day after their arrival, she marched onto our driveway again, clipboard in hand. Emily was outside painting, a faint breeze lifting her hair. Jack was seated nearby, casually cleaning a fishing rod. Margaret's eyes narrowed at the sight of him. "And who might you be?" Jack looked up slowly, his calm gaze meeting hers. "Family," she sniffed. "Well, tell your family that this ramp is still in violation. And now we've had reports of noise. Her painting outside is a disturbance." Emily's brush froze mid-stroke. "Painting is a disturbance?" she whispered. James, who had been standing near the porch, stepped forward. "Funny thing about disturbances, they tend to go both ways, like trespassing onto someone's driveway without permission." Margaret bristled, clearly unused to being challenged. "I'm the HOA president. I have every right to inspect violations." Jack stood, his 6-foot frame towering over her. His voice was even, but it carried the weight of command. "Not without 48-hour written notice, according to Section 7.2 of your own bylaws." He held up a highlighted page James had tucked into his pocket. For the first time, Margaret's composure faltered. James smiled coldly. "We'll be documenting everything from now on, so by all means keep coming by. Just know that every word, every step, every lie will be on record." Margaret's face flushed crimson. "You don't know who you're dealing with." Jack leaned closer, his voice low and steady. "Neither do you." She stormed off, heels clicking angrily on the pavement, blinds twitching in windows as neighbors peeked out at the confrontation. Word spread quickly. The Carters weren't bowing anymore. That night, as the family sat together, Emily whispered, "I felt safe today. For the first time in months, I felt like she couldn't touch me." Jack squeezed her shoulder. "That's because she can't. She just doesn't know it yet." The twins' strategy was working. The neighbors who had once stayed silent began knocking on our door, offering their own stories of Margaret's tyranny. A small coalition was forming, united by years of frustration. But Margaret wasn't going to surrender quietly. She called an emergency HOA board meeting, sending out notices accusing our family of aggression, intimidation, and harassment. She wanted to flip the script back, to paint us as the villains once again. What she didn't know was that my brothers were already 3 steps ahead. Because this wasn't just a fight anymore, it was a mission. And Jack and James Carter had never failed a mission in their lives. The night before the emergency HOA meeting, our living room looked less like a family home and more like a command center. Testimonies were spread across the table, bylaws highlighted, video clips cued on Jack's laptop. The air buzzed with focus, the same kind of electricity I imagined my brothers felt before stepping into combat zones overseas. Emily sat nearby, nervous but determined. "Do you think this will work?" she asked. Jack gave her a steady look. This isn't just going to work. This is going to end it." The next evening, the Oak Ridge Estates clubhouse filled with homeowners. Normally these meetings were dull affairs with coffee urns and half-empty folding chairs. Not this time. The room was packed. Word had spread about the Carters standing up to Margaret, and curiosity drew even the most indifferent residents. Margaret stood at the front, dressed in her sharpest navy blazer, her clipboard poised like a scepter. Her voice was dripping with authority as she began. "We are here to address the serious violations committed by the Carter family. Their unauthorized ramp, illegal business activities, and hostile behavior toward this community cannot go unchecked." Murmurs rippled through the crowd. James leaned over to me, whispering, "Wait for it. She's about to overplay her hand." Right on cue, Margaret slammed a stack of papers onto the podium. "Furthermore, we have received complaints about noise disturbances and inappropriate use of property." That was Jack's signal. He rose slowly, the room quieting as his presence filled the space. Calm, commanding, unshakable. "I'd like to respond," he said, his voice carrying across the hall. Margaret sneered. "Only board members may—" "Actually," James interrupted, waving a highlighted page from the bylaws. Section 4.8 states that any homeowner accused of violations has the right to speak in their defense at an HOA meeting. "Funny how you forgot that part?" A ripple of laughter broke the tension. Margaret's smile faltered. Jack stepped forward. "My sister Emily has lived in this neighborhood her entire life. She was paralyzed in an accident when she was 16. That ramp you call a violation? It's her lifeline, and it's protected under federal law, the Americans with Disabilities Act. You've been harassing her for months, fining her illegally, calling the police on her, humiliating her in her own home." He paused, then nodded toward James, who clicked a button on the laptop. The projector lit up with footage. Margaret standing on our driveway, berating Emily, calling her ramp an eyesore. Another clip showed her trespassing without notice, clipboard in hand. Another showed her whispering to officers, smirking as Emily cried, Gasps filled the room. Neighbors exchanged looks of shock and anger. Jack's voice was steady, almost cold. This is not leadership. This is abuse of power. And it ends tonight. James stepped forward, his eyes locked on Margaret. We've gathered testimonies from over a dozen residents. Fined for bird feeders, for parking, for children's lemonade stands. You've turned this community into your personal kingdom. But kingdoms fall. One by one, neighbors stood. The elderly couple who'd been fined for their bird feeder. The father whose truck was nearly towed. Parents whose children were reduced to tears when their lemonade stand was shut down. Voices rose, louder and louder, until the room was buzzing with outrage. Margaret tried to regain control, banging the gavel. Order! Order! These accusations are baseless, Jack cut her off. Baseless? The bylaws you enforce illegally are right here. The federal laws you've ignored are right here. And the proof of your harassment is on video for everyone to see. Margaret's face turned crimson. You can't do this to me. I've run this community for 10 years. James stepped closer, his voice low but clear. And tonight you're done. The board members, pale and shaken, had no choice. With the crowd demanding action, they held a vote. The result was swift and decisive. Margaret Whitfield was removed as HOA president effective immediately. She stood frozen, her mouth opening and closing like a fish out of water, until finally she snapped her clipboard in half and stormed out, her heels clacking like gunfire against the tile. The once smug Queen of Oak Ridge had been dethroned. The room erupted in applause. Neighbors cheered, some even hugging us. Emily's cheeks were wet with tears, not of sorrow this time, but of relief. For the first time in years, she felt seen, defended, protected. That night back at home, we sat on the porch together. The air felt lighter. The house felt safe again. Emily leaned against Jack, her voice soft. I thought she was going to break me. But you didn't let her, Jack smiled. No one breaks family, not on our watch. James raised a beer bottle, clinking it against mine. Mission accomplished. Mom laughed for the first time in months, a sound I'd almost forgotten. I think I might actually enjoy living here again. As the sun dipped below the horizon, neighbors walked by, waving, stopping to thank us. The fear that once lingered on their faces was gone, replaced by pride. We weren't just a family that survived Margaret's tyranny. We had united the whole community against her. And Emily? She painted again the very next morning. Bright, bold colors. A canvas filled with hope, because justice had been served. And sometimes it doesn't take armies or weapons. Sometimes it just takes family, standing together, refusing to bend, fighting with truth instead of fear. For Margaret, it was the end of her reign. For us, it was the beginning of peace. And for Emily, it was freedom. When the HOA sent cops to harass my disabled sister, they thought we would fold. They thought fear would drive us out. But they forgot one thing. You can't bully a family that refuses to break. With the help of my twin Navy SEAL brothers, we turned the tables, exposed the truth, and reclaimed our home. So if you've ever been pushed down, humiliated, or told you don't belong, remember this. Bullies only win when you stay silent. Stand up, fight back, and you might just write your own ending too.